The last patient of the
I
day
understand.
had barely walked out before Dr. Margaret Holloway leaned back in her
I'm
chair
afraid.
and let the silence of the office settle around her like something she had earned. Outside, Boston was doing what Boston does in October, turning the light gold and cold at the same time, as if the city couldn't commit to either warmth or winter. She watched the Charles River from her window, a habit she'd developed over the 17 years she'd run this psychiatric practice, the slow water a kind of anchor on days when everything else moved too fast. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Dave. You still at the office? I need to talk. It's about Nora. Margaret read it twice. Nora. She knew that name the way you know a song you've never actually heard, but somehow always recognized, through the stories Dave had been telling her for the better part of 2 decades. Nora, who lost her first tooth at a Red Sox game. Nora, who cried at the airport when she left for her MFA program in Edinburgh. Nora, who Dave swore was going to change the world if the world would just hold still long enough. She typed back, "Still here. Come by." Dave Callahan had been Margaret's closest friend since graduate school at Boston University, when they were both 26 and convinced they were going to save the world through different doors. Him through education, her through the mind. They'd grown up in parallel, the way old friends do, marriages and divorces on her side. A long happy marriage and 3 kids on his. Careers that had diverged and then reconnected at odd angles. He showed up 20 minutes later with his coat still damp from the rain, and that particular look he wore when he wanted something and hadn't figured out how to ask for it yet. Margaret handed him a coffee without being asked. He took it without saying thank you, which meant things were serious. "She's back," he said. "I know. You called me from the airport. She's back and she's different." He wrapped both hands around the mug. Quieter, more settled. I don't know how to explain it. She went to Scotland as one person and came home as someone I recognize but don't fully know yet. That's called growing up, Dave. I know what growing up looks like. This is something else. He looked at her across the rim of the mug. She wants to open a private therapy practice, specializing in creative professionals, writers, musicians, artists. She has the credentials. She has the vision. What she doesn't have is any kind of foothold here. She's been gone 3 years. Margaret understood where this was going before he finished. She needs introductions, Margaret said. She needs someone in her corner who has a name in this city. He set the mug down. You have that name, Maggie. You've had it for years. I'm not asking you to carry her, just to point her in the right direction. Margaret looked at him for a moment. She knew this man's face as well as she knew her own reflection, every line of it. The way his eyes went slightly uncertain when he was asking for something he wasn't sure he deserved. Bring her to the symposium next Thursday, she said. I'll introduce her around. The rest is up to her. Dave let out a long breath, the kind that had clearly been held for a while. You're the best person I know, he said. I'm the only person who answers your calls after 9 p.m. That's a different category. He laughed, and things were easy again the way they always were between them. The symposium was held in a function room at Massachusetts General, all low lighting and name tags, and the particular anxiety of people who spent their professional lives making others comfortable, now trying to make themselves comfortable with each other. Margaret arrived early. She had a habit of that, arriving before the room filled, getting her bearings, deciding where she wanted to stand. She was at the bar ordering sparkling water when Dave found her, Nora walking beside him. Margaret had, over the years, assembled a mental picture from Dave's descriptions and the occasional photo he'd shown her. She'd expected someone who looked like Dave, warm, expansive, easy in a crowd, the kind of young woman who fills a room by moving through it loudly. Nora Callahan did fill the room, but not loudly. She was 27. Margaret knew that, had known it intellectually, but she moved with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with age. Tall, with her father's dark eyes and an expression of careful, genuine attention on her face. Dressed simply in a way that suggested she'd thought about it and then decided not to think about it too much. She was looking around the room the way a therapist looks at a room, Margaret thought, reading the structure of it before the people in it. When their eyes met, Nora smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't come with performance attached. Dr. Holloway, Dave said, doing the introduction with a formality that was slightly embarrassing, My daughter, Nora, just Margaret, she said, and extended her hand. Nora shook it with the confidence of someone who'd been taught that a handshake was worth getting right. My dad talks about you constantly, Nora said. I feel like I've known you for years. His version of me is probably more flattering than the reality. He said you're the most honest person he's ever met, and that you don't suffer fools. Nora's expression was perfectly level. That sounds about right from where I'm standing. Margaret looked at her for a half-second longer than she'd intended. They spent the next 2 hours moving through the room together, which hadn't been the plan, but which happened with a naturalness that made planning seem beside the point. Margaret made introductions. Nora handled them beautifully, direct without being aggressive, warm without being deferential, asking the right questions and listening to the answers in a way that made people feel genuinely heard. She's going to be good at this, Margaret thought. Watching her work a conversation with 2 senior clinicians, she already is. At one point, Dave got pulled away by a colleague, and they were briefly alone near the window, the city glittering behind the glass. You didn't expect this, Nora said, not unkindly. Expect what? Someone you'd actually want to talk to. She said it without vanity, just observation. You've been doing your dad a favor all night. About an hour ago, it stopped feeling like that. Margaret considered denying it, decided not to. You're perceptive, she said. Occupational hazard. A slight smile. Though I think it was already there before the degree. Your father says you've wanted to do this since you were a teenager. My father remembers everything through a very loving filter. Nora turned to look at the city. I wanted to understand people. The degree was just the most useful structure for that. What made you come back? Nora was quiet for a moment, not the uncomfortable quiet of someone searching for an answer, but the comfortable quiet of someone deciding how much of the real one to offer. Edinburgh gave me room to become someone, she said finally. Boston is where I get to find out if she holds up. Dave reappeared before Margaret could respond, and the moment folded itself up and tucked away. But she carried it home. That night, in the apartment she'd lived in alone for 6 years since her divorce, Margaret sat on the couch with a book she wasn't reading, and thought about nothing in particular for longer than she usually allowed herself. She's 27, she thought. Dave's daughter. Stop. She opened the book, read the same paragraph 3 times, put it down. In the 2 weeks that followed, Margaret did what she'd promised. She made calls, sent emails, attached her name to Nora's in the way that names carry weight in a field where reputation is everything. She didn't think of it as doing Dave a favor. When she looked at what Nora was building, the intake framework she'd developed, the specific niche she'd identified, the thoughtfulness of her approach, she thought of it as pointing something good in the direction it deserved to go. Nora sent updates that were precise and unhurried, met with the director of the Arts Center. Very promising. Thank you for the connection. The group practice reached out. I'm going to sit with it for a few days before I respond. I don't know how to properly thank you for this. Margaret kept her responses short and professional. Appropriate. The correspondence of 2 people in a mutual professional courtesy. It was Nora who changed the temperature on a rainy Wednesday night. Can I ask you something that has nothing to do with any of this? Margaret was at the kitchen island, a glass of wine in front of her, the kind of evening that stretches on without offering anything to do in it. Depends on the question. My dad says you haven't been in a relationship since your divorce. Is that true? Or is he just bad at reading people? Margaret put down the wine glass. He's usually excellent at reading people. In this case, he's also right, might by choice. She thought about that for a moment, typed and deleted 2 versions of an honest answer, before settling on a third. By accumulated preference, nothing felt worth the complication. A pause. Then, I understand that more than you might think. Edinburgh? Margaret typed. Edinburgh had one significant complication. It taught me a lot, including that I'd rather be alone than approximate. Approximate. Close to something, but not it. Margaret read that word and felt something in her chest that she chose, for the moment, not to examine. Tell me about Edinburgh, she wrote. The conversation lasted until well past midnight. They fell into a rhythm of talking that neither of them had planned or discussed. It wasn't flirtatious. Margaret was clear with herself about that, in the systematic way she applied clarity to things she was trying not to feel. It was exchange. Nora had a mind that worked sideways. She'd approach a subject from an angle you didn't expect, and arrive at something true. She pushed back when she disagreed, and she did it without apology, which Margaret found so rare it almost made her laugh the first time it happened. They talked about the field, about the particular loneliness of creative people, about the gap between how therapy was practiced and what patients actually needed, about what it meant to hold someone's most difficult material without being changed by it. Margaret had these conversations with colleagues, but they had the quality of professional exchange. With Nora, they felt like thinking out loud. And Nora asked questions nobody had asked Margaret in a long time, real ones. What does rest look like for you? Not vacation. Actual rest. When did you last do something that scared you? Do you like your life, or have you just gotten good at it? That last one Margaret didn't answer immediately. She sat with it for a day and a half before she typed anything back. Both. I think both can be true at the same time. They can, Nora replied. I just wondered if you'd thought about it. The accidental meeting happened on a Sunday morning at a bookstore in Cambridge, the good independent one that smelled of old paper and coffee, and had survived 20 years of being told it wouldn't survive. Margaret was in the psychology section, not looking for anything specific, which was rare for her. She heard someone say her name and turned. Nora was standing at the end of the aisle with a book tucked under her arm, and the expression of someone who was not entirely surprised by the coincidence. Of course it's you, Margaret said. Of course it's this section, Nora replied. They ended up at the coffee counter, then walking along the river, then sitting on a bench in the weak October sun for longer than either of them acknowledged. They talked about the book Nora had been looking for, about a paper Margaret had read that week, about the way Boston felt different when you'd been away from it and then returned. At some point, the conversation drifted, and Margaret found herself talking about the year her marriage ended, not the details, but the texture of it. The way a life can look correct from the outside and feel slightly wrong from the inside for so long that you stop trusting your own calibration. You knew before you admitted it, Nora said. Not a question. I knew for longer than I'd like to say. What made you stop pretending? Exhaustion, mostly. Margaret looked at the river. You can sustain almost anything, but eventually the pretending costs more than the truth. Nora was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet, genuinely processing, not just pausing. I think that's the most common thing I see, she said finally. People who are exhausted by the distance between what they are and what they've been presenting. It doesn't even have to be dramatic. It just adds up. You're describing it from the outside. I'm describing it from the outside and the inside. Margaret looked at her. Scotland, Nora said simply. They sat with that for a while, the river moving steadily past them, the city going on around them. Walking back, Nora said, this was good. It was. I don't think it was entirely accidental, Nora said. I was in the neighborhood. You live in the South End. Margaret didn't answer, which was, she understood, its own kind of answer. That night she stood at the window for a long time, the lights of the city blurred by the glass, with the particular discomfort of someone who has spent a career helping other people name things, and suddenly cannot find words for something of her own. She's 27, she thought. She's Dave's daughter. This is not a thing. The city didn't have anything useful to say about it. Neither did she. It was Nora who suggested dinner. She sent the message on a Tuesday afternoon, direct and without preamble, which was exactly the way she did everything. I want to actually thank you, not in a text, with food. You pick. Margaret held the phone for a moment longer than made sense. That's not necessary. I know it's not necessary. That's not why I'm suggesting it. A beat. Saturday, 7. I'll send you the address. The restaurant Margaret chose was quiet, in a neighborhood that was neither hers nor Nora's, which she recognized as a decision she'd made without consciously making it. Nora arrived exactly on time in dark slacks and a cream blouse that suggested she'd thought about it without appearing to have thought about it. She moved to the table with the ease of someone comfortable in their own body, which Margaret found herself noticing and then noting that she'd noticed, which was not useful. She sat across from Margaret and opened the menu without immediately looking at it. You almost canceled, she said. I had a late call. That's not what I mean. Margaret set her menu down. You do that thing, she said, where you say what you think is happening before anyone confirms it. I do it when I'm fairly confident. Nora finally looked at the menu. Am I wrong? A pause. No. The waiter came. They ordered. Wine arrived, and with it the particular grace of having something to do with your hands. For a while the conversation moved through safer ground. The practice Nora was building, a case study she was working through without identifying details, a conference Margaret had attended in September that had been half useful and half theater. They were good at talking. That had been established. The ease of it was, Margaret had begun to understand, part of the problem. It was somewhere after the entrees that the temperature of the evening shifted. Can I ask you something personal? Nora said. You always ask permission, and then ask regardless. Nora smiled slightly. When did you know? Margaret didn't need her to explain. She was quiet for a moment, turned her wine glass by the stem. Late, she said. Much later than I should have. How late? I was in my mid-30s. I'd been married for 8 years. Nora said nothing. Just listened, which Margaret had noticed was something Nora did better than almost anyone she knew. Full, unperformative listening. It wasn't a moment of clarity, Margaret said, her voice dropping slightly without her intending it to. It was more like a slow accumulation of things I'd been explaining away for years, until I couldn't explain them anymore. The marriage? We ended it with more grace than I deserved, honestly. He's a good man. We're still cordial. There's no daughter or son complicating things, which made it cleaner. She paused. I don't think I've talked through it in that sequence with anyone in years. Why are you talking through it now? Margaret looked at her steadily. I don't entirely know. Nora was quiet for a moment. I've known since I was a teenager, she said. It wasn't discovery, it was just delayed arrival. I knew what I was. I just needed space to be it without having to explain myself constantly. Edinburgh gave you that. Edinburgh gave me that. A small pause. Coming home is different. My dad still has a particular idea about what my future looks like. I think he knows without knowing, if that makes sense. It makes complete sense. The not knowing is more comfortable for him right now, so I let it be. Margaret nodded slowly. She'd held that kind of thing for people for her entire professional life. The way families accommodated truth by leaving it slightly unlit. The dessert menus came and went untouched. In their place, a different kind of quiet settled, not absence of conversation, but the presence of something that had been named, or nearly named, and was now sitting between them on the table, visible and unclaimed. You're afraid of me, Nora said. Not an accusation, the same calm register she used for everything. Margaret looked at her. I have perspective, she said. They can feel similar, but they're not. What perspective? You're my best friend's daughter, a beat. You're 27, I'm 52. Those are facts, Nora said gently. I'm not sure they're reasons. The silence that followed was the kind that sits comfortably rather than uncomfortably. The weight of something real having been placed on a table between two people who both know it's there and are deciding separately what to do with it. Margaret paid the check. Outside on the sidewalk, the October air sharp and clean, they stood for a moment. Thank you for dinner, Nora said. You were supposed to be thanking me. I am thanking you. She looked at Margaret with those steady, reading eyes. Just correctly. She left first, walking unhurried into the city. Margaret stayed on the sidewalk longer than made practical sense, the cold working through her coat, with something in her chest that had stopped being nameable as anything other than what it was. She didn't sleep easily that night. She made tea that went cold on the counter, and stood in the kitchen looking at the life she'd assembled. The shelves of clinical texts, and a few novels she actually loved. The artwork she'd chosen carefully over years, the very ordered solitude of all of it. And she thought, this is a life you've gotten very good at. Which wasn't the same as a life you'd chosen. Dave called on a Friday morning with no text beforehand, which was always a signal. Margaret answered from the couch, coffee in hand, still in the early stillness she protected before the workday claimed her. Do you have time this weekend? His voice was careful, not angry. Careful. For what? To talk. In person. They met at a park near Brookline where they used to walk when they lived closer to each other. Years ago, when the city felt smaller, and life was less complicated. The maples were turning hard orange and red, the kind of autumn that looks like a painting and makes you slightly suspicious. They walked for a while without talking, which was something they'd always been able to do. Nora came home last night in a particular way, Dave said finally. Margaret kept walking. Not bad, he said quickly. Nothing bad. Just, I've known her since she was born, Maggie. I know every version of her face. And there's a version I recognize, he paused. The version where she's moved by something, in the way that matters. Dave, let me finish. He stopped walking, turned to face her. I'm not here to start something. I'm here because we've been friends for 26 years, and I would rather ask you directly than spend another week building theories in my head. She held his gaze. What do you want to ask? What's going on between you and my daughter? The park continued around them, indifferent. A dog ran past, chasing nothing. Somewhere a child shouted in delight for reasons invisible. Nothing is happening, she said. Margaret. Dave. Nothing has happened. I didn't ask what happened. I asked what's going on. She closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them, there was a tiredness in her face that wasn't about being tired. I don't know, she said. And it was the truest thing she'd said in weeks. He waited. I didn't look for it, she said. You brought her to me. I helped her because that's what I said I'd do, and because she's genuinely talented and it felt right to. And then somewhere in there, she stopped. She's remarkable, Dave. You know that better than anyone. She's 27. I'm aware. You're 52. Also aware. She's my kid, Maggie. His voice didn't break. It went quiet, which was worse. She's my daughter. I know. She said it softly. And I haven't done anything to betray your trust. Not yet. Not yet. The words were out before she decided to let them go. Dave looked at her with the full weight of 26 years of knowing her, every version of Margaret Holloway he'd witnessed from the front row, the young therapist, the wife, the divorced woman rebuilding quietly, the professional, the one who insisted she was fine. What are you going to do? He asked. I don't know. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have right now. A long silence. The leaves moved overhead. Does she feel it too? He said finally. Don't spare me. Yes, Margaret said, quietly enough that it was almost just for herself. I think you already know that. Dave closed his eyes. When he opened them, what was there wasn't anger. She'd prepared herself for anger and would have understood it. What was? There was something older and more complicated. The expression of a person being asked to be larger than what they feel, and not yet knowing if they can manage it. I need time, he said. So do I. They walked back to the parking lot without talking. At the cars, Dave stopped. 26 years, Maggie, he said, looking ahead. 26 years, she confirmed. He drove away without the usual goodbye. The first time in over 2 decades, Margaret didn't contact Nora that day, or the next. On the third night, at nearly midnight, her phone lit up on the nightstand. Nora. He talked to you. Not a question. Margaret stared at it for a long time in the dark. He did, she breathed. I need some time to think, Nora. The response came slower than usual. Okay, but don't go quiet on me. That's all I'm asking. Margaret held the phone against her chest in the dark and felt with complete clarity the thing that the rest of her had already decided, even while her mind was still in session, still deliberating, still listing reasons. 3 weeks. Margaret moved through them the way she moved through everything she didn't know how to face directly, by working harder. More sessions, more reading, more of the disciplined busyness that had gotten her through her divorce, through her mother's illness, through every large thing she'd processed from the outside rather than the inside. But the work didn't fill the particular shape of it this time, because Nora hadn't vanished, hadn't pushed. She had simply continued, building the practice, seeing early clients, living her life with a steady, unhurried dignity that Margaret found both admirable and, in a way she couldn't fully articulate, unbearable. They didn't speak for 21 days. On the 22nd, Dave called. "Come have coffee with me," he said. His voice was different. Still weighted, but differently weighted. The weight of someone who had arrived somewhere after a long walk, rather than the weight of someone just setting out. They met at the cafe where they'd celebrated graduations, promotions, and once, memorably, the end of a very bad year. It smelled like espresso and rain-damp coats and something vaguely seasonal. Dave was there first, 2 cups already on the table. He slid one to her when she sat down. They drank in silence for a moment. "I talked to Nora," he said. "Really talked. One of those conversations that leaves you tired in a different way than other tired." Margaret waited. She told me everything. The dinners, the conversations, what she feels. He paused. "What you feel." "Dave, no, let me." He turned the cup in his hands. "I was angry. I was scared. I had that thing parents get where you suddenly realize your child has an entire interior life that doesn't pass through you. And it's irrational, but it still hits you like a wall." Margaret was quiet. But after the anger, he stopped, reorganized. "I started thinking about you instead. About how many times you showed up for me when you didn't have to. How many of Nora's birthday dinners you came to when I know you hate that kind of thing. How you've been the most consistent, honest person in my life for longer than most of my family relationships have lasted." He looked up. "None of that stopped being true. I haven't done anything to earn what you're doing right now," she said. "Maybe not. But I'm doing it anyway." He refilled his cup from the small carafe. "I'm not telling you I'm comfortable with everything," he said. "I'm not. I still do this thing in my head where I try to make it make sense, and it doesn't quite resolve. Maybe it never will." A tired, genuine smile. "But 26 years is 26 years, and my daughter is an adult, and you are the most decent person I know." He let that sit for a moment. Those things don't cancel each other out. They just all have to exist at the same time. That's uncomfortable, but it's what's true. Margaret looked at him across the table. The years in his face, the gray that had come in at his temples, the eyes that were exactly the same as they'd always been, and felt something for him that she didn't have a word for, something between gratitude and grief, and the deep, specific tenderness of very old friendship. "I don't know where this goes," she said honestly. "Nobody knows where anything goes. That's the part we all collectively pretend not to know." She laughed, a real one, the kind that carries relief in it. When they left, Dave hugged her on the sidewalk, fully, without reservation, the kind of hug that has history in it. She held on just as long. Margaret called Nora that afternoon. Not a text, a call. Nora answered on the second ring. "Hi," she said. Just that. But the single word contained 3 weeks of waiting without complaint. "Can I come by?" Margaret said. A very brief pause. "Yes." Nora's apartment was in Jamaica Plain, a neighborhood that was still becoming itself, always slightly in the middle of some evolution. She'd taken a top-floor unit with good light and not much else, and turned it into a workspace that looked exactly like her. Walls covered in reference materials and handwritten notes, a large desk facing the window, books shelved not alphabetically or by subject but in some private logic that suggested a system Margaret didn't know yet, but could imagine learning. It smelled like coffee and something warm and specific that Margaret understood she was going to remember. Nora was standing when she arrived, by the window with a mug, not rushing to fill the space between them. Margaret looked around the room for a moment. "I talked with Dave," she said. "I know. And I needed 3 weeks to arrive at a conclusion you'd probably already reached." Nora waited. "I don't know how to do this without it being complicated," Margaret said. "I don't know how to promise things I'm not sure I can deliver. I don't know what it looks like from here. And that bothers me because I have spent my entire adult life needing to know what things look like from here." "I know," Nora said again softly, "but I know that those 3 weeks were the longest I've had in a very long time." She paused. "And I know that's not a small thing." Nora set the mug on the desk. She walked across the room without hurrying. She stopped close. "I'm not asking for certainty," she said. "I'm asking for honesty. You just gave me that." The silence between them wasn't empty. It was the silence of two people finally occupying the same place at the same time. Margaret reached out and touched her face. Gently, carefully, the way you touch something you've been unsure was real. It was. Nora's hand came up to cover hers. Unhurried, the way she did everything. They stayed that way for a moment that didn't need to be anything more than what it was. It wasn't simple after that. It never is. There were hard conversations with Dave, who had good days and less good days, and was, as he'd promised, trying. With Margaret's ex-husband, who handled the news with the quiet generosity of someone who had long since wished her well without conditions. With colleagues who found out and offered opinions nobody requested, because colleagues always do. There was a Sunday dinner eventually, where Dave and Nora and Margaret sat at the same table, and nobody quite knew what to do with the silverware for the first few minutes. But there was also an afternoon, months later, when Dave and Margaret walked in the same park where everything had cracked open, and he told her, without looking at her, that he was doing better than he'd expected. That it was getting easier to hold it all at once. That was enough. It was the kind of enough that you learn to receive without asking for more. In February, on one of those Boston Saturdays that lies about being almost spring, Margaret and Nora went to a new gallery in the South End that one of Nora's clients had mentioned. Small rooms, emerging artists, work that made you slow down instead of speeding up. They stopped in front of a large piece near the back. Deep blue and ash gray, abstracted and textured, with a thin line of pale gold running diagonally across the whole surface, corner to corner. "What do you see?" Nora asked. Margaret looked at it for a while. "Someone who crossed something," she said, and came out the other side still themselves. Nora turned to look at her, with that same attention she'd had from the very beginning, the kind that didn't flinch. "Yeah," she said, "that's it exactly." They stood there together in the quiet of the gallery, the gold line crossing the canvas between its dark edges, not needing to know what came next. Just there, just present. Which, for two people who had each spent a long time carefully managing their distance from the present, was more than it looked like. It was maybe everything. Not every story begins in the right place or at the right time. Some begin precisely where they shouldn't, with every reasonable argument against them. And they happen anyway. Not because love is blind, but because sometimes it's the only thing that's actually paying attention.